Corporal Masao Fujimoto pressed his face against the cold metal bars of his prison cell, watching as American guards ladled steaming beef stew into metal bowls. The rich aroma made his stomach clench with hunger, but his pride burned hotter than his empty belly. For 3 days, he and his fellow prisoners had refused every meal, letting the bread grow moldy and the stew grow cold. They would rather starve than accept food from their captors. But as Fujimoto's vision blurred and his knees buckled, one desperate bite would shatter everything he believed about honor, pride, and the enemy he'd been taught to hate. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Henderson, a prisoner of war facility nestled in the rolling hills of Northern California. It was March 1943, and the war in the Pacific raged on with no end in sight. Behind the double rows of barbed wire, 217 Japanese soldiers sat in their barracks, their faces gaunt, but their spirits unbroken. Among them was Corporal Masao Fujimoto, a 24-year-old from Osaka, whose dark eyes held the fierce determination that had carried him through countless battles before his capture on Guadalcanal. Fujimoto remembered the day he was taken prisoner with crystal clarity. The jungle had been thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. His unit had been cut off from the main force for 3 days, surviving on rainwater and the occasional wild fruit. When the American Marines finally surrounded them, Fujimoto's commanding officer had ordered them to fight to the last man. But as his comrades fell around him, struck down by superior firepower and endless waves of enemy soldiers, Fujimoto found himself alone, his rifle empty, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. The American soldier who captured him was younger than Fujimoto had expected, perhaps 19 or 20, with kind blue eyes and trembling hands. The boy had spoken to him in broken Japanese, trying to reassure him that he wouldn't be harmed. Fujimoto had spat at his feet in response, earning himself a rifle butt to the stomach. Even now, months later, the memory of that humiliation burned in his chest like a coal that refused to die. Captain Harold Morrison, the commanding officer of Camp Henderson, had dealt with difficult prisoners before, but nothing quite like this. He stood in his office, reviewing the reports that crossed his desk each morning, and shook his head in bewilderment. For the past week, the latest batch of Japanese prisoners had refused all food. Not just refused, but actively rejected it with a vehemence that bordered on the theatrical. They would knock over the food trays, throw bread back at the guards, and turn their backs when meals were served. Morrison had served in the First World War and understood the concept of military pride. He had seen German prisoners maintain their dignity even in defeat. But this was different. These men seemed willing to starve themselves to death rather than accept American hospitality. The camp doctor, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Benjamin Crawford, had warned Morrison that several of the prisoners were showing early signs of malnutrition. Their weight was dropping rapidly, and their physical condition was deteriorating by the day. The kitchen staff, led by Sergeant Paul Rodriguez, had tried everything. They prepared meals that were as close to Japanese cuisine as their limited supplies would allow. They served rice when they could get it, prepared fish in simple broths, and even attempted to make something resembling miso soup using ingredients they found in the local town. Nothing worked. The prisoners would examine the food suspiciously, exchange words in rapid Japanese, and then push the bowls away with expressions of disgust. Rodriguez, a first-generation American whose parents had immigrated from Mexico, understood something about cultural pride and the importance of food in maintaining one's identity. He had grown up eating his grandmother's traditional dishes and knew how foreign food could seem threatening, almost insulting, when you were far from home. But he also understood that these men were slowly killing themselves, and he couldn't stand by and watch it happen. In the prisoner barracks, Fujimoto sat on his thin mattress, his back against the wall, watching his fellow prisoners with growing concern. Private Hiroshi Nakamura, barely 18 years old, had been captured in the same battle as Fujimoto. The boy's cheeks, once round and full, had hollowed out dramatically in recent days. His uniform, which had once fit snugly across his shoulders, now hung loose on his diminishing frame. Next to Nakamura sat Sergeant Kenji Watanabe, a career soldier in his 30s who had served in China before being transferred to the Pacific Theater. Watanabe had been the most vocal in his rejection of American food, declaring it unfit for human consumption and referring to their captors as barbarians who didn't understand the first thing about proper nutrition or culinary preparation. He had rallied the other prisoners to his cause, invoking their duty to the emperor and their obligation to maintain Japanese honor even in captivity. But honor was a cold comfort when your stomach felt like it was eating itself from the inside. Fujimoto closed his eyes and tried to remember his mother's cooking. She had made the most incredible gyoza, perfectly pleated dumplings filled with pork and cabbage that she would fry until the bottoms were crispy and golden. On special occasions, she would prepare sukiyaki, thin slices of beef cooked in a sweet soy sauce broth with vegetables and tofu. The memory was so vivid, he could almost taste it, which made the gnawing hunger in his belly even more unbearable. The sound of boots on concrete announced the arrival of the afternoon meal. 3 American guards entered the barracks, carrying large pots of what appeared to be beef stew and baskets of freshly baked bread. The aroma that filled the room was rich and hearty, completely different from the delicate flavors Fujimoto associated with proper food, but undeniably appetizing. His mouth watered involuntarily, and he had to swallow hard to maintain his composure. Sergeant Watanabe stood up immediately, his voice carrying across the barracks as he addressed his fellow prisoners in Japanese. His words were sharp and commanding, reminding them of their duty, their heritage, and their obligation to resist American attempts to corrupt their bodies and spirits. The younger prisoners nodded along, but Fujimoto could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They were hungry, desperately hungry, and the smell of the stew was making it hard to concentrate on concepts like honor and duty. The guards set down their containers and began ladling stew into metal bowls, placing them on a long wooden table near the entrance to the barracks. They worked efficiently and without comment, though Fujimoto noticed one of them, a young man with red hair and freckles, glancing sympathetically at the prisoners. When they finished serving, the guards retreated to the doorway but didn't leave. They had learned to wait, hoping that hunger might eventually overcome pride. For several minutes, the standoff continued. The prisoners remained seated on their bunks, studiously ignoring the steaming bowls of stew and the warm loaves of bread. But the smell was overwhelming, filling every corner of the barracks with the promise of warmth and satisfaction. Fujimoto's stomach cramped violently, a pain so sharp it made him gasp. Beside him, he heard Nakamura's stomach rumbling loudly, a sound that seemed to echo through the silent room. Watanabe shot a warning look at the younger man, but Nakamura was beyond caring about appearances. He was 19 years old and had been surviving on nothing but water for days. His body was consuming its own muscle tissue, and his vision occasionally blurred when he stood up too quickly. The stew represented life itself, regardless of where it came from or who had prepared it. Dr. Crawford made his rounds that evening, checking on the prisoner's condition with growing alarm. He had served as a military physician for 15 years and had seen the effects of starvation before, but never self-imposed starvation on this scale. The men were losing weight at a dangerous rate, and their mental faculties were beginning to suffer as well. Severe malnutrition could lead to permanent damage to vital organs, including the brain and heart. He spoke quietly with Captain Morrison after completing his examination, recommending immediate intervention. The camp had protocols for dealing with hunger strikes, including forced feeding if necessary, but Morrison was reluctant to take such extreme measures. He believed that respect and patience might eventually win over these proud soldiers, and he didn't want to resort to tactics that might be considered inhumane. Meanwhile, in the town of Henderson, just 5 miles from the prison camp, the local community was following the situation with intense interest. The war had touched every family in the area. Boys who had graduated from Henderson High School were fighting in Europe and the Pacific, and the casualty reports that appeared in the weekly newspaper were a constant source of anxiety and grief. Mrs. Dorothy Collins, who ran the local diner, had heard about the prisoners' refusal to eat from her nephew, who worked as a guard at the camp. She couldn't understand why anyone would choose to starve, regardless of their circumstances. In her practical Midwestern mind, food was food, and hungry people should eat whatever was available. She began preparing extra portions of her famous cornbread and apple pie, hoping that Captain Morrison might be willing to offer them to the prisoners as an alternative to the standard military rations. At the general store, old Pete Harrison, whose grandson was somewhere in the Philippines fighting against the very men now held at the camp, had a different perspective. He believed the prisoners were being stubborn and ungrateful, and that they deserved whatever fate befell them. His wife, Margaret, disagreed strongly, arguing that Christian charity demanded they show compassion even to their enemies. Their discussions grew heated, reflecting the broader debate taking place throughout the community. Back in the barracks, the fourth night of the hunger strike was the worst yet. Fujimoto lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his entire body aching with hunger. Sleep came in brief, restless intervals, interrupted by dreams of food and memories of home. He dreamed of his father's small restaurant in Osaka, where customers would line up for bowls of ramen so rich and flavorful that the broth seemed to contain the essence of comfort itself. His father had been a master of his craft, spending years perfecting recipes that had been passed down through generations. He would start each morning before dawn, preparing the broth that would simmer all day, filling the restaurant with an aroma that drew customers from blocks away. Fujimoto had worked in the restaurant as a boy, learning to prepare noodles and vegetables with the precision his father demanded. It had been a good life, simple and satisfying, until the war changed everything. Now, lying in this foreign prison, Fujimoto wondered if he would ever taste his father's cooking again. The war seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, with no clear victor in sight. Letters from home had stopped coming months ago, and he had no way of knowing if his family was safe or if the restaurant still stood. The uncertainty was almost as painful as the hunger gnawing at his insides. Nakamura was worse off than the others. His youth, which should have been an advantage, worked against him in this situation. His metabolism was higher, burning through his body's reserves more quickly than the older men. He had stopped speaking entirely, conserving energy by remaining as still as possible. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and Dr. Crawford was genuinely concerned that the boy might collapse before morning. The crisis came at dawn, on the fifth day. Fujimoto was awakened by the sound of retching, followed by Watanabe's urgent voice calling for help. Nakamura had fallen unconscious during the night, and was now lying on the floor beside his bunk, his face pale and his pulse barely detectable. Dr. Crawford was summoned immediately, and he worked frantically to stabilize the young prisoner, while the other men watched in silent horror. It was a moment of truth that shattered the unity of their resistance. Watching Nakamura hover between life and death, the abstract concepts of honor and duty suddenly seemed less important than the immediate reality of survival. Several of the prisoners began to murmur among themselves, questioning whether their sacrifice was worth the life of one of their youngest members. Fujimoto felt something break inside his chest, a barrier that had been holding back not just hunger but common sense and basic human decency. These Americans were feeding them not out of cruelty, but out of obligation, perhaps even kindness. They could have provided minimal rations, bread and water sufficient to keep their prisoners alive, but miserable. Instead, they offered hearty stews and fresh bread, meals that smelled like comfort and tasted, he imagined, of home. When the morning meal arrived, the usual standoff began. But this time, Fujimoto found himself standing up, his legs shaky, but his resolve firm. Watanabe looked at him sharply, his eyes flashing with warning and disappointment. The sergeant spoke quietly but firmly, reminding Fujimoto of his duty to his comrades and his country. But Fujimoto was beyond such appeals now. He was a soldier, but he was also a human being, and human beings needed to eat to survive. He walked slowly to the table where the bowls of stew waited, each step requiring tremendous effort. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, weak and unsteady after days of insufficient nutrition. The other prisoners watched in stunned silence as their fellow soldier, one of the most respected among them, approached the forbidden food. The stew was thick with chunks of beef, carrots, and potatoes, swimming in a rich brown gravy that smelled of herbs and comfort. Steam rose from the bowl, carrying with it the promise of warmth and satisfaction. Fujimoto picked up a spoon, his hand trembling not just from hunger, but from the magnitude of what he was about to do. He was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, abandoning a principle that had seemed absolute just moments before. The first spoonful was a revelation. The meat was tender and flavorful, seasoned with familiar spices that reminded him unexpectedly of his mother's cooking. The broth was rich and warming, filling his mouth with tastes that his body recognized and craved. It wasn't Japanese food, but it was good food, prepared with care and skill by people who understood that nutrition was about more than just staying alive. As he continued eating, Fujimoto felt strength returning to his body in waves. The cramping in his stomach eased, replaced by a warm satisfaction that spread through his limbs like sunlight. His mind, which had been foggy and slow for days, began to clear. Colors seemed brighter, sounds more distinct, as if he were emerging from a long tunnel into daylight. The other prisoners watched in fascination and growing temptation as Fujimoto finished his bowl and reached for a piece of bread. The bread was still warm from the oven, with a crispy crust and soft interior that yielded perfectly to his teeth. He closed his eyes and chewed slowly, savoring not just the taste but the simple act of eating, something he had taken for granted for most of his life. One by one, the other prisoners began to move. First the older men, who had perhaps seen enough of war and death to value practical survival over abstract principles. Then the younger soldiers, their bodies crying out for nourishment, too loudly to ignore any longer. Even Watanabe, after a long moment of internal struggle, finally stood and walked to the table. The sergeant's face was a mask of conflicted emotions as he picked up a bowl and began to eat. Fujimoto could see the shame and relief warring in his expression, the knowledge that he was betraying his own orders, while simultaneously saving his own life. It was a moment of profound humanity, a recognition that survival sometimes required compromise, and that rigid adherence to principle could become a form of slow suicide. Within minutes, the entire barracks was filled with the sound of men eating, not just consuming food but devouring it with the desperate hunger of the nearly starved. Spoons clinked against metal bowls, and the prisoners spoke quietly among themselves, their voices stronger already than they had been in days. Some of them smiled for the first time since their capture, not from happiness, but from simple physical relief. The American guards watched this transformation with their own complex mixture of emotions. They had been trained to view these men as enemies, soldiers who had fought to kill Americans and destroy American interests in the Pacific. But seeing them now, weakened by their own stubborn pride and finally accepting help, it was impossible not to feel some measure of compassion for their situation. Sergeant Rodriguez felt a particular satisfaction as he watched the prisoners eat. He had spent days trying to find the right combination of flavors and ingredients that might appeal to their tastes, working within the constraints of military supply chains and limited resources. The fact that they were not just eating but apparently enjoying the food validated his efforts and his belief that good cooking could bridge cultural divides. Over the following days, the atmosphere in Camp Henderson changed dramatically. The prisoners, no longer weakened by hunger, began to participate more actively in camp life. They answered questions from American intelligence officers, helped with maintenance tasks around the facility, and even began to learn basic English from some of the guards. The wall of hostility that had separated captors and prisoners began to erode, replaced by something approaching mutual respect. Fujimoto found himself in an unusual position among his fellow prisoners. His decision to eat first had made him both a leader and a pariah, depending on which group of men he was speaking with. Some viewed him as a pragmatist who had saved their lives by breaking the deadlock of their hunger strike. Others saw him as a traitor who had abandoned Japanese principles for American food. But as the days passed and the prisoners regained their strength, even his harshest critics had to admit that Fujimoto had made the right choice. Nakamura, who had nearly died from starvation, was back on his feet within a week, his youthful resilience allowing him to recover more quickly than the older men. He sought out Fujimoto privately to express his gratitude, admitting that he had been too proud and too frightened to make the first move himself. The meals became a highlight of each day rather than a source of conflict. Sergeant Rodriguez worked with the prisoners to incorporate some Japanese flavors and techniques into the American menu, creating fusion dishes that satisfied both nutritional requirements and cultural preferences. He learned to prepare rice properly, not the mushy, overcooked grain that Americans typically served, but the perfectly steamed, slightly sticky rice that formed the foundation of Japanese cuisine. In return, some of the prisoners began sharing their own knowledge of food and cooking. Fujimoto taught Rodriguez how to make a simple dashi broth using kelp and bonito flakes that the camp was able to procure from a Japanese grocery store in San Francisco. The result was a soup that tasted like home to the prisoners, while introducing the American kitchen staff to completely new flavors and cooking techniques. These culinary exchanges led to broader conversations about culture, family, and life before the war. Fujimoto told Rodriguez about his father's restaurant, describing the careful preparation that went into each bowl of ramen and the satisfaction of serving food that brought people together. Rodriguez shared stories of his grandmother's kitchen in Guadalajara, where she had taught him that cooking was an act of love that could transcend language and cultural barriers. Captain Morrison observed these changes with growing optimism. He had feared that the prisoner situation might become a permanent source of conflict and potential violence, but instead, it had evolved into something approaching cooperation. The prisoners were no longer sullen and resistant, but engaged and, in some cases, almost friendly. They followed camp rules, participated in work details, and showed respect for American authority while maintaining their own dignity and cultural identity. The transformation was noticed by officials higher up the military chain of command. General Robert McNamara, who oversaw prisoner operations for the entire Pacific Theater, visited Camp Henderson to observe the situation firsthand. He was impressed by what he saw and asked Morrison to document his methods for potential implementation at other facilities dealing with similar problems. The success at Henderson demonstrated that treating prisoners with respect and cultural sensitivity could produce better results than harsh discipline or cultural suppression. The prisoners, who had once seemed like dangerous fanatics, revealed themselves to be ordinary soldiers, far from home and struggling with their own fears and uncertainties. They missed their families, worried about the war's outcome, and hoped to survive long enough to return to their normal lives. Fujimoto received a letter from home after 6 months in captivity, the first communication he had received since his capture. The Red Cross had finally established reliable mail service between Japan and American prisoner facilities, allowing families to maintain contact with their captured loved ones. The letter was from his sister, written in the careful characters he remembered from childhood. She told him that their parents were well but worried constantly about his safety. The restaurant had been converted to serve military rations as part of the war effort, but their father hoped to return to normal operations once peace was restored. She asked him to take care of himself and to remember that his family was praying for his safe return. The letter ended with a simple message that brought tears to his eyes. She loved him and would be waiting for him when the war was over. That evening, Fujimoto shared the contents of his letter with some of his closest friends among the prisoners. They talked about their own families, their hopes for the future, and their fears about what they might find when they finally returned home. The war had changed all of them, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. They were not the same young men who had marched off to fight for the emperor's glory. As winter approached, the prisoners were allowed to participate in more activities around the camp. They helped with harvesting vegetables from the camp garden, a project that had been started to provide fresh produce for both prisoners and guards. Fujimoto discovered that he had a talent for gardening, probably inherited from his grandfather, who had grown rice and vegetables on a small farm outside Osaka. Working in the earth, planting seeds and watching them grow, gave Fujimoto a sense of purpose and connection to life beyond the war. The simple act of nurturing plants from seedlings to maturity reminded him that there was still beauty and hope in the world, even in the midst of global conflict. He began to dream not just of going home, but of starting his own garden, perhaps even expanding his father's restaurant to include fresh vegetables grown with his own hands. The garden project brought prisoners and guards together in ways that formal activities had not. They worked side by side, sharing knowledge about different plants and growing techniques, learning from each other despite the language barriers that still existed. Some of the guards had been farmers before the war, and they taught the prisoners about American agricultural methods that were different from, but not inferior to, Japanese techniques. Sergeant Rodriguez continued to experiment with fusion cooking, combining American ingredients with Japanese techniques to create dishes that pleased both prisoners and guards. His beef and vegetable stir-fry, prepared in the style of Japanese yakitori but using local California produce, became so popular that other camps began requesting the recipe. The dish represented something larger than just food. It was a symbol of how different cultures could combine and create something new and valuable. The news from the Pacific Theater remained grim throughout 1943 and into 1944. American forces were making steady progress, island by island, toward Japan itself, but the cost in human life was enormous. Both sides were suffering massive casualties, and the prisoners at Henderson received regular updates about the war's progression through carefully censored news reports. For Fujimoto and his fellow prisoners, these reports were deeply conflicting. As Japanese soldiers, they wanted their country to be victorious, but as human beings who had experienced American hospitality and kindness, they found it difficult to maintain their hatred for their captors. The guards who brought them food each day were not the monsters that Japanese propaganda had described. They were young men, much like themselves, who missed their families and hoped to survive the war. The complexity of these feelings came to a head when news arrived of a major American victory in the Philippines. The prisoners received the news in silence, understanding that this represented another step toward Japan's eventual defeat. Some of them felt relief that the war might end sooner, while others experienced shame at their own conflicted loyalties. That evening, Fujimoto found himself sitting with Captain Morrison, who had begun making regular visits to the prisoner barracks to check on conditions and morale. They communicated through a combination of basic English, elementary Japanese, and hand gestures, but somehow managed to understand each other well enough to have meaningful conversations. Morrison asked Fujimoto what he thought about the war's progress and whether he believed Japan could still achieve victory. It was a dangerous question that could be interpreted as an attempt to extract military intelligence, but Fujimoto sensed that Morrison was asking out of genuine curiosity rather than professional duty. He answered honestly, explaining that most of the prisoners had come to believe that Japan's position was helpless, but that they still hoped for a negotiated peace that would allow their country to maintain some dignity. This conversation led to others, more personal and more revealing. Morrison told Fujimoto about his own experiences in the First World War, when he had been wounded in France and spent several months recovering in a hospital filled with soldiers from both sides. He had learned then that war was ultimately about ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances, and that the enemy was usually not as different from yourself as you had been taught to believe. As 1944 progressed, the quality of life at Camp Henderson continued to improve. The prisoners were allowed to form clubs and organize activities that helped pass the time and maintain morale. Fujimoto started a cooking club that taught other prisoners how to prepare simple dishes using ingredients available in the camp commissary. The club became popular not just among Japanese prisoners, but also among some of the American guards who were interested in learning about different cuisines. The success of these programs led to expanded privileges for the prisoners. They were allowed to receive packages from family members in Japan, though these were carefully inspected for contraband. They could write longer letters home and receive more frequent correspondence. Some prisoners were even allowed to take correspondence courses from American universities, learning English and other subjects that might be useful after the war ended. For Fujimoto, these opportunities represented a chance to prepare for a future beyond the war. He enrolled in a business course offered through the University of California, hoping to learn management techniques that he could apply to his father's restaurant after his return to Japan. The coursework was challenging, especially in a language he was still learning, but it gave him a sense of purpose and forward momentum that had been missing from his life since his capture. The approach of spring in 1945 brought with it rumors of major developments in the war. The prisoners could sense a change in the attitudes of their guards, who seemed more confident and optimistic about the war's eventual outcome. Letters from home arrived less frequently, and when they did arrive, they often contained hints about shortages and hardships on the Japanese home front. Fujimoto's sister wrote that food was becoming scarce in Japan and that people were being encouraged to grow their own vegetables wherever possible. She described how their father had converted part of the restaurant's dining room into a small garden where he grew radishes and other hardy vegetables. The letter painted a picture of a country under severe strain, struggling to maintain normal life in the face of increasing military pressure. These reports from home made the prisoners more aware of how fortunate they were to be in American custody. While their families in Japan were dealing with food shortages and constant fear of air raids, the prisoners at Henderson were eating regular meals and living in relative safety. This realization created complex feelings of guilt and gratitude that were difficult to reconcile with their identities as Japanese soldiers. The guilt was particularly acute for Fujimoto, who had become something of a leader among the prisoners and a liaison with the American camp administration. His fluency in English and his willingness to cooperate with camp authorities made him valuable to both sides, but it also marked him as a potential collaborator in the eyes of some of his fellow prisoners. He walked a careful line, trying to help his comrades while maintaining his own integrity and self-respect. As summer arrived, rumors began circulating about a new American weapon of unprecedented power. The details were vague and contradictory, but the guards seemed nervous and excited in equal measure. There was talk of a bomb so powerful that it could destroy entire cities, though such claims seemed too fantastic to believe. The prisoners dismissed most of these rumors as American propaganda designed to weaken Japanese morale. But on August 6, 1945, the rumors became horrifying reality. News of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima reached Camp Henderson within hours, though the full magnitude of the destruction would not become clear for several days. The prisoners received the news in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the scale of devastation described in the initial reports. Fujimoto felt as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. Hiroshima was only a few hundred miles from his home in Osaka. He knew people who lived and worked in Hiroshima, relatives and friends who might have been vaporized in an instant by this incomprehensible new weapon. The thought that such destruction was possible, and that it had been inflicted on Japanese civilians, filled him with horror and despair. The bombing of Nagasaki 3 days later confirmed that the first attack had not been an isolated incident, but part of a deliberate American strategy to force Japan's surrender through overwhelming terror. The prisoners understood immediately that the war was effectively over. No country could continue fighting against an enemy capable of erasing entire cities with single bombs. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15 was almost anticlimactic after the atomic bombings. The prisoners gathered in the camp's main hall to listen to a translated version of the emperor's speech, in which he announced Japan's surrender and called on his people to endure the unendurable in accepting defeat. For men who had been taught that surrender was worse than death, the emperor's words represented a fundamental transformation of everything they believed about honor, duty, and sacrifice. The immediate aftermath of surrender was a period of profound confusion and uncertainty for both prisoners and guards. No one was quite sure what would happen next, or how long it would take to arrange for the repatriation of Japanese prisoners. The war was over, but the practical challenges of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners to their home countries would take months or even years to resolve. During this transitional period, life at Camp Henderson continued much as it had before, but with a different psychological atmosphere. The prisoners were no longer enemy soldiers, but displaced persons waiting to return home to a country that had been transformed by defeat. The guards, meanwhile, faced the challenge of maintaining security and discipline among men who were no longer technically prisoners of war. Fujimoto found himself in an unusual position during this period. His language skills and his relationship with the camp administration made him valuable as a translator and intermediary, helping to facilitate communication between the American authorities and the Japanese Gasa prisoners. He helped organize the distribution of Red Cross packages, assisted with medical examinations, and served as a liaison in planning for eventual repatriation. This role gave him access to information about conditions in Japan that was not available to the other prisoners. He learned about the extent of destruction caused by American bombing campaigns, the severe food shortages that affected most of the population, and the massive disruption to normal life caused by military defeat. The Japan he would return to was not the country he had left when he went to war. The first groups of prisoners were repatriated in late 1945, but Fujimoto was not among them. His usefulness to the camp administration, combined with his own uncertainty about what awaited him at home, led him to volunteer to stay longer and help with the repatriation process. He wrote to his family explaining his decision and assuring them that he was safe and well treated, but that he felt an obligation to help his fellow soldiers during this difficult transition. His sister's response revealed the depth of change that had occurred in Japan during his absence. She wrote that their father's restaurant had been destroyed in an air raid 6 months before the war's end, and that their parents were living with relatives in the countryside. Food was still scarce, and jobs were difficult to find. She encouraged him to stay in America as long as possible, suggesting that he might find better opportunities there than in the devastated homeland. This letter forced Fujimoto to confront a possibility he had never seriously considered, that of remaining in America permanently. The idea was both appealing and terrifying. America had treated him well during his captivity, better than he had any right to expect as an enemy soldier. The country offered opportunities for rebuilding his life that might not exist in war-torn Japan. But America was also foreign, alien in ways that went beyond language and customs. He discussed the possibility with Captain Morrison, who had become something approaching a friend during their long association. Morrison was honest about the challenges Fujimoto would face as a Japanese immigrant in America, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a bitter war. There would be prejudice and suspicion from some Americans who could not separate individual Japanese people from their wartime enemies. But there would also be opportunities for those willing to work hard and adapt to American ways. The decision ultimately came down to a question of where Fujimoto could build the most meaningful life. Japan offered family and cultural familiarity, but also destruction, poverty, and limited prospects for the immediate future. America offered freedom and opportunity, but also isolation, and the challenge of creating a new identity in an unfamiliar culture. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had become Fujimoto's closest American friend, offered him a different perspective on the choice. Rodriguez explained that America was a country built by immigrants, people who had left their homelands to seek better lives in a new place. He assured Fujimoto that while the transition would be difficult, America had a long tradition of eventually accepting those who proved themselves through hard work and good citizenship. More importantly, Rodriguez offered Fujimoto a concrete opportunity. He was planning to open his own restaurant after his discharge from the Army, and he needed a partner who understood both American and Asian cuisines. The fusion cooking they had developed at Camp Henderson could be the foundation for a new type of restaurant that would appeal to Americans while honoring Japanese culinary traditions. The offer was tempting, but also overwhelming. Fujimoto would be giving up his entire previous life, abandoning his family and his country for the uncertain promise of success in a foreign land. It was the kind of decision that could not be reversed, a choice that would define the rest of his life and determine whether he would die as a Japanese man who had lived in America or as an American who happened to be born in Japan. As he wrestled with this decision, Fujimoto received one final letter from his sister that helped clarify his thinking. She wrote that their father, now in his 60s, had given up hope of rebuilding the restaurant and was working as a day laborer to support the family. Their mother was ill, suffering from malnutrition and the stress of constant uncertainty about their future. The family needed money more than they needed his physical presence, and if he could find a way to send financial support from America, it would do more good than his return to share their poverty. This letter released Fujimoto from the obligation of filial duty that had been holding him back from making a complete commitment to staying in America. He could serve his family better by succeeding in America and sending money home than by returning to Japan and adding another mouth to feed in an already desperate situation. It was a practical decision, but also an emotional one that acknowledged the reality of post-war conditions in both countries. In January 1946, Fujimoto made his decision. He would remain in America and accept Rodriguez's offer to become a business partner in the new restaurant. The paperwork was complex, requiring sponsorship from American citizens and approval from immigration authorities who were still suspicious of Japanese nationals. But Captain Morrison, who was transitioning back to civilian life, agreed to serve as a sponsor and character witness. The restaurant opened in San Francisco in the spring of 1946, in a small building in the Fillmore district that had previously housed a bakery. Fujimoto and Rodriguez worked 18-hour days to transform the space, installing new equipment and creating a menu that combined American comfort food with Japanese techniques and flavors. They called it The Bridge, a name that reflected their hope of connecting two cultures through food. The early days were challenging in ways that neither man had anticipated. Many potential customers were still suspicious of anything associated with Japan, and some veterans refused to eat food prepared by a former enemy soldier. There were protests outside the restaurant during its first week, led by families who had lost sons in the Pacific War. Fujimoto watched from behind the kitchen window as angry crowds demanded that he be sent back to Japan, their faces twisted with grief and rage that he understood all too well. But there were also supporters, people who believed that the war was over and that America should live up to its ideals of tolerance and opportunity. Captain Morrison brought his family for dinner on opening night, making a public statement of support that was noted by local newspapers. Dr. Crawford, who had left the Army and was now working at San Francisco General Hospital, became a regular customer and brought colleagues who were curious about the innovative fusion cuisine. The food itself gradually won over skeptics who came to criticize, but stayed to eat. Fujimoto's beef teriyaki, prepared with American cuts of meat but seasoned with Japanese sauces and techniques, became the restaurant's signature dish. Rodriguez's Mexican-influenced rice dishes, combined with Fujimoto's delicate tempura vegetables, created combinations that customers had never experienced before but found irresistibly appealing. Word of mouth spread slowly but steadily throughout San Francisco's diverse neighborhoods. The city's Chinese community, initially suspicious of Japanese competition, discovered that Fujimoto's cooking was distinctly different from their own culinary traditions and did not represent a threat to POWs. Established Chinese restaurants. Italian families from North Beach found that the emphasis on fresh ingredients and careful preparation resonated with their own food culture. Within 6 months, the Bridge had developed a loyal following of customers who appreciated both the quality of the food and the symbolism of what the restaurant represented. Food critics from San Francisco newspapers began writing reviews that praised the innovative menu and the story of cooperation between former enemies. One reviewer wrote that eating at the Bridge was like tasting the future of America, where different cultures blend together to create something entirely new and uniquely American. The success of the restaurant allowed Fujimoto to begin sending money home to his family in Japan, as he had promised. His letters to his sister included detailed descriptions of life in America and explanations of how the restaurant business worked. He encouraged his father to consider immigrating to America if conditions in Japan did not improve, though he knew that the older man would probably never leave his homeland. His sister wrote back with news that their father had found work helping to rebuild restaurants in Osaka, using skills he had developed over decades in the food service industry. The American occupation authorities were encouraging the revival of small businesses as part of the effort to rebuild Japan's economy, and there was growing demand for experienced restaurant workers. Their mother's health had improved with better nutrition, made possible in part by the money Fujimoto sent home each month. As 1947 progressed, Fujimoto began to feel truly at home in America for the first time since his capture. He had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of San Francisco, building relationships with suppliers, customers, and other business owners. His English had improved dramatically, though he still spoke with an accent that marked him as foreign-born. He had started dating an American woman named Patricia Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American who worked as a nurse at the hospital where Dr. Crawford was employed. Patricia understood something about the challenges of being Asian in America, though her family's experience as voluntary immigrants was very different from Fujimoto's journey as a prisoner of war. She helped him understand American customs and social expectations while respecting his desire to maintain connections to his Japanese heritage. Their relationship was controversial in some circles, both because of his status as a former enemy soldier and because of the complex dynamics between different Asian communities in California. But Patricia's family accepted Fujimoto after meeting him and seeing how he treated their daughter. Her father, who had immigrated from Guangdong province in the 1920s, recognized a fellow immigrant trying to build a new life in a foreign country. He offered Fujimoto advice about dealing with discrimination and building business relationships in the Chinese community, which controlled much of the wholesale food trade in San Francisco. The restaurant continued to grow and evolve, adding new dishes as Fujimoto experimented with different ingredients and techniques. He developed a following among San Francisco's artistic community, writers and painters who appreciated the creativity of his fusion cuisine and the welcoming atmosphere of the restaurant. Some of them became regular customers who would spend hours discussing art, politics, and philosophy over long meals that stretched well into the evening. These conversations exposed Fujimoto to ideas and perspectives that challenged his understanding of America and his place within it. He learned about the country's history of immigration and internal conflict, its struggles with racism and inequality, and its ongoing efforts to live up to the ideals expressed in its founding documents. America was not the simple, unified enemy that Japanese propaganda had portrayed, but a complex, contradictory nation still defining itself and its values. One conversation that particularly affected him was with an African-American jazz musician named Robert Washington, who had served in the Pacific Theater and had been present at some of the same battles where Fujimoto had fought on the opposite side. Washington spoke about the irony of fighting for American freedom overseas while facing discrimination and segregation at home. His perspective helped Fujimoto understand that his own experience as an outsider seeking acceptance was part of a larger American story about inclusion and exclusion. As 1948 began, Fujimoto made another major decision about his future. He applied for American citizenship, beginning the lengthy process that would formally transform him from a former enemy alien into an American citizen. The application required extensive documentation of his activities since arriving in the United States, character references from American citizens, and sworn statements that he renounced any allegiance to foreign governments. The citizenship process was complicated by his status as a former prisoner of war, which required special approval from federal authorities, who were still concerned about the loyalty of former enemy soldiers. Captain Morrison, now working as a civilian administrator for the Veterans Administration, helped navigate the bureaucratic challenges and provided testimony about Fujimoto's conduct during his imprisonment and his contributions to American society since his release. The wait for approval was anxious and uncertain, filled with periodic interviews and background checks that required Fujimoto to account for every aspect of his life and beliefs. Immigration officials questioned him extensively about his military service, his reasons for wanting to become an American citizen, and his plans for the future. Some of the interviews felt hostile, conducted by officials who seemed to view his application with suspicion and distrust. But there were also supportive voices in the process. Dr. Crawford wrote a letter of recommendation describing Fujimoto's character and his contributions to the San Francisco community. Regular customers of the bridge submitted statements praising his work ethic and his positive influence on the neighborhood. Even some veterans organizations, initially opposed to granting citizenship to former enemy soldiers, eventually supported his application after learning about his story and meeting him personally. Patricia stood by him throughout the citizenship process, despite pressure from some members of her own family who worried about the complications of marrying someone with his background. Her father defended the relationship, arguing that Fujimoto had proven himself through his actions and that America's strength came from its ability to transform former enemies into loyal citizens. Her mother was more cautious, but eventually came to appreciate Fujimoto's dedication to building a good life in America. In the spring of 1949, Fujimoto received word that his citizenship application had been approved. The ceremony took place in a federal courthouse in San Francisco, where he stood with dozens of other new Americans from countries around the world. As he raised his right hand and recited the oath of allegiance, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this severe moment, from a Japanese soldier fighting against America to an American citizen committed to the country's principles and values. The ceremony was attended by friends and supporters who had helped him along the way. Rodriguez was there, now a full partner in the expanding restaurant business. Patricia sat in the front row, wearing the engagement ring he had given her the month before. Captain Morrison had driven down from Sacramento, where he was now working for the state government. Even some of his former fellow prisoners, who had chosen to return to Japan that maintained correspondence with him, sent congratulatory letters that were read aloud during the reception following the ceremony. Fujimoto's new citizenship opened doors that had previously been closed to him. He was now eligible for bank loans that allowed him to expand the bridge into a larger location in Union Square. He could travel freely within the United States and even abroad, though he had no immediate plans to visit Japan. Most importantly, he could now sponsor family members for immigration to America, a possibility that interested his sister, who was struggling to support her children in post-war Japan. The expanded restaurant became one of San Francisco's most popular dining destinations, featured in guidebooks and recommended by hotel concierges to visitors from around the world. Food critics from national magazines wrote articles about Fujimoto's innovative cuisine and his remarkable personal story. The restaurant employed 15 people by 1950, including several other Japanese immigrants who had come to America in search of better opportunities. But success brought new challenges and responsibilities. Fujimoto found himself becoming a spokesman for the Japanese-American community, invited to speak at events, and interviewed by reporters who wanted to understand the immigrant experience. He was asked to serve on civic committees and to participate in cultural exchanges designed to improve relations between America and Japan. These public roles, sometimes uncomfortable for someone who preferred to focus on cooking and running his business. He was not a natural politician or public speaker, and he worried about saying something that might be misinterpreted or cause controversy. But he also understood that his success carried obligations to help others who faced similar challenges, and he tried to use his platform to advocate for tolerance and understanding. His marriage to Patricia in 1951 was a significant social event that symbolized the changing attitudes toward Asian immigrants in post-war America. The wedding was held at a Catholic church in Chinatown, reflecting Patricia's family's religious traditions, with a reception at the bridge that featured foods from both Japanese and Chinese culinary traditions. The guest list included people from many different backgrounds, united by their connection to the couple and their support for what the marriage represented. The birth of their first child, a son they named David, in 1952, marked another milestone in Fujimoto's transformation from Japanese soldier to American father. Holding his son for the first time, he thought about the future this child would inherit, a future shaped by choices he had made during those difficult days in Camp Henderson more than a decade earlier. David would grow up as an American citizen, free from the conflicts and divisions that had defined his father's early life. As the 1950s progressed, Fujimoto watched as America's relationship with Japan evolved from former enemies to allies in the Cold War. The Korean War, which began in 1950, demonstrated that the strategic situation in Asia had changed dramatically since the end of World War II. Japan was now viewed as a crucial partner in containing communist expansion, and former Japanese soldiers like Fujimoto were no longer seen as potential threats, but as valuable allies who understood BRAC, Asian culture, and politics. This changing relationship allowed Fujimoto to reconnect with his homeland in ways that had not been possible immediately after the war. He began corresponding with former military colleagues who had returned to Japan and were rebuilding their lives in the new democratic society. Some of them expressed interest in immigrating to America, and Fujimoto was able to help several find opportunities in the growing Japanese business community on the West Coast. In 1955, Fujimoto made his first return visit to Japan since his capture in 1942. The country he found was dramatically different from the one he had left. The physical destruction from the war had largely been repaired, but the social and cultural changes were more profound and lasting. Japan was no longer a militaristic empire, but a peaceful democracy, focused on economic development rather than territorial expansion. His reunion with his family was emotional and complex. His parents had aged significantly during his absence, and his father's health had been permanently damaged by malnutrition during the worst years of the post-war period. His sister had married and had children of her own, and she looked at her American brother with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. He was clearly successful and happy, but he was also foreign in ways that went beyond his American clothes and confident demeanor. The visit to his hometown of Osaka revealed how completely his old life had been erased by war and reconstruction. The family restaurant was gone, replaced by a modern office building. The neighborhood where he had grown up had been rebuilt with wider streets and newer buildings that bore no resemblance to his childhood memories. Even the people seemed different, more westernized and less formal than the Japanese he remembered from before the war. During his stay in Japan, Fujimoto was invited to speak at several universities and business organizations about his experiences in America. His story was seen as inspirational by young Japanese who were interested in international opportunities, but also controversial among older people who viewed his decision to become an American citizen as a betrayal of his Japanese identity. He tried to explain that love of country did not require hatred of other countries, and that it was possible to honor one's heritage while embracing new opportunities. The most difficult moment of his visit came when he traveled to Hiroshima to see the site where the atomic bomb had been dropped 10 years earlier. Standing in the rebuilt city center, looking at the peace memorial that marked the epicenter of the explosion, he struggled to reconcile his gratitude for American kindness with the knowledge of what American weapons had done to Japanese civilians. It was a complexity that could not be resolved through simple emotions or political positions, but had to be lived with as part of the cost of war and the price of peace. His return to San Francisco was a relief, a homecoming to the life he had built through years of hard work and careful choices. The bridge had continued to thrive during his absence, managed by Patricia and Rodriguez with the help of experienced staff who had learned Fujimoto's methods and standards. His son David, now 3 years old, had grown noticeably during the month-long trip and greeted his father with enthusiasm that reminded Fujimoto where his primary loyalties now lay. The 1960s brought new challenges and opportunities as American society underwent rapid changes in attitudes toward race, immigration, and cultural diversity. The civil rights movement created a more welcoming environment for all minorities, including Asian Americans who had previously faced significant discrimination. The immigration law reforms of 1965 opened the door for increased Asian immigration, bringing new customers and employees to Fujimoto's expanding restaurant empire. By 1968, the bridge had grown into a small chain of 5 restaurants throughout the San Francisco Bay Area, each specializing in different aspects of Asian American fusion cuisine. Fujimoto had become a respected figure in California's business community, serving on the boards of several civic organizations and charitable foundations. He had also become a mentor to other Asian immigrants, helping them navigate the challenges of starting businesses and adapting to American society. His success allowed him to support not only his immediate family, but also relatives in Japan, who were still struggling with the long-term effects of the war. He funded scholarships for Japanese students who wanted to study in America, and he contributed to relief efforts when natural disasters struck Japan. These activities helped him maintain connections to his homeland while fulfilling his obligations as an American citizen. The most satisfying aspect of his later career was training the next generation of chefs and restaurateurs, many of them young Asian Americans, who saw him as a pioneer who had opened doors that they could now walk through. He taught them not just cooking techniques, but also business principles and the importance of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to American expectations. His influence extended far beyond his own restaurants, shaping the development of Asian cuisine throughout the American West. In 1975, 30 years after the end of World War II, Fujimoto was invited to return to Camp Henderson, which was being converted into a historical site commemorating the prisoner of war experience. Walking through the barracks where he had once been held, he thought about the young man he had been and the choices that had shaped his life. The camp that had once represented confinement and uncertainty had actually been the beginning of his American journey. The place where he had learned that former enemies could become friends and that cultural differences could be bridges rather than barriers. The ceremony dedicating the historical site was attended by former prisoners and guards from camps throughout the American West. Many of them had maintained friendships that had begun during the war, relationships that transcended national boundaries and political differences. Rodriguez was there, now retired but still Fujimoto's business partner and closest friend. Captain Morrison, in his 70s but still sharp and energetic, gave a speech about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of circumstances. As Fujimoto stood before the memorial plaque that would commemorate the experiences of prisoners and guards alike, he thought about the meal that had changed everything, the simple bowl of beef stew that had represented his first step toward becoming an American. Food had been the bridge that connected him to his captors, and it had remained the foundation of his success in his adopted country. In choosing to eat that stew, he had chosen life over death, hope over despair, and the future over the past. The speech he gave that day was brief but heartfelt, focusing on the power of small acts of courage and kindness to transform relationships and build understanding between different peoples. He talked about the guards who had continued to offer food even when it was rejected, the cooks who had tried to accommodate cultural preferences, and the administrators who had treated prisoners as human beings, rather than objects of hatred. But mostly he talked about the importance of being willing to change, to abandon preconceptions and prejudices when experience revealed them to be false. His journey from Japanese soldier to American citizen had required constant adaptation and growth, a willingness to embrace new ideas and new ways of being in the world. It was a message that seemed particularly relevant in an era when America was struggling with questions about diversity, inclusion, and what it meant to be American. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Fujimoto walked once more through the camp where his American story had begun. The barracks were empty now, preserved as historical artifacts rather than living spaces. But he could still imagine the sounds and smells of that long-ago time. He could see himself as a young man, proud and stubborn and hungry, facing the choice that would define the rest of his life. In the end, the choice had been simple, though it had taken days of suffering to make it. He had chosen to live, and in choosing to live, he had chosen to become someone new. The boy who had refused American food had become a man who fed Americans, who had found his place in the world by helping others find nourishment and satisfaction. It was a story that could only have happened in America, in a country built by immigrants and refugees, by people who had the courage to leave everything behind and build something new. The bridge that gave his restaurant its name had become a metaphor for his entire life, a span connecting two worlds that had once seemed irreconcilably different. Food had been the material from which that bridge was built, but it was sustained by qualities that transcended any single culture, qualities like courage, compassion, and the fundamental human need to nurture and be nurtured. In feeding others, Fujimoto had fed himself. In accepting the kindness of strangers, he had learned to extend kindness to strangers in return. And in that exchange, in that simple act of sharing a meal across the boundaries of language and culture and history, something essentially American had been created. Not the America of political speeches or patriotic slogans, but the America of everyday generosity, of second chances and new beginnings, of the possibility that anyone could become anything if they were willing to work for it and worthy of the opportunity. As Fujimoto drove away from Camp Henderson for the final time, heading back to his restaurant and his family and his life as an American citizen, he carried with him the knowledge that his story was both unique and representative, both personal and universal. He had been one of millions of immigrants who had found their way to America through circumstances beyond their control, who had discovered in this strange land possibilities they had never imagined in their countries of birth. The taste of that first spoonful of American stew still lingered in his memory, not because of its flavor, but because of what it had represented, the moment when hunger had overcome pride and opened the door to everything that followed. It had been, he realized, the most important meal of his life, the bite that had made him an American.